their reasoning for wanting to become a laundress, especially a military laundress, where there's a lot of different little reasons. And basically, especially in the mid-19th century, unless you were a woman of wealth who had servants, every woman would have been trained from a very young age on how to do laundry and what the steps were. And it was just part of the culture that that was woman's work. It also, the laundry had to be done. It was also a job, career, whatever you want to call it in today's modern lingo, was one of the acceptable professions that a woman could do. Now, before we go too far, yes, if you've ever read anything, there's always been a whole lot of euphemisms about doing laundry and being a laundress. Some of them might have been true, but to be honest, in most of the research I've done over the last nearly 40 years, that makes me shudder, by the way, to think that I've been doing this research for almost 40 years. But in reality, in most of the research I've done, the women who were listed as laundresses really were doing laundry. Now, whether they were doing anything else on the side, I can't tell you, but they were doing laundry in some level and respect. Otherwise, they would have gotten booted out of the camps. Big reason for doing laundry and taking in somebody else's laundry was to make money for the family. And let's face it, in the mid-19th century, most women didn't have a way of making money for themselves or making a name or a position for themselves. It just wasn't. You were part of what your husband did. And that was a lot of the culture back then. For military spouses, especially, like at Fort Steilacoom, like at Fort Wilkins, where I first got started, it was the one way that a married couple could potentially stay together, especially when you got out on the frontier posts. In the 1840s, when Fort Wilkins, which is in the very northern part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was, in the 1840s, when that fort first got started, it was a very frontier fort. And the only way that women were allowed to be able to be part of with their husband and their families on the post was if they were doing something that was allowable, like being a post laundress, unless they were an officer's wife. An officer's wife could often accompany her husband and she didn't have to do the work. So you don't find out too often because it was such a common kind of thing to do laundry. It wasn't something that was being journaled about. It wasn't something that was being written about. In some cases, it was barely being talked about because one, it was an everyday common occurrence. You had to do laundry. Everybody had to do laundry. And also you certainly didn't want to be talking about your unmentionables in public. So it's not something that there's a lot written about. However, there are a couple, and I'm going to bend down here, a couple of books. If you ever have a chance to see this book on Soapsuds Row, one of the interesting parts of this book is in the back, they do, I think it was this one, they have a list of laundresses at different military posts. So that is one way we've gotten some names. Now, depending on the time period, the money and whatever else the laundresses were being reimbursed for or given to become a laundress did change a bit over the years, but it's amazing over about 30, 40 years, it didn't change a lot. So we know a little bit about some of the laundresses. Some of them we can find in some of the official records because the military laundresses were the only women for many, many years who were actually acknowledged to be part of the post and be in the written records. For example, when I was first getting trained to portray laundress Kate Holmes, and that was a fictitious name because we weren't sure if we were going to have any of the real laundresses' descendants come through the fort. But when I was learning about Kate Holmes, I was actually learning about the laundress's name there was actually Catherine. And Catherine, we knew just this much about what she was doing because there were some official records that were left about her and one of the other laundresses who, for whatever reason, wasn't name by name. So let's jump into what these women were doing, how they were earning their keep so that they were part of these official records. Well, here at Fort Steilacoom, some of the information that we know about is that there were about, usually you had one laundress in the 1830s, 1840s for about every 17 men. A little longer if you go a little further in time, and this one puzzles me, they raised it up to that you could have a laundress for every 19 and a half men. I haven't figured out where that half came from and what you did with the other half if he wasn't there. So that one's always perplexed me, is how did you move up to from 17 full men to 19 and a half men? But I'm sure the military had that somehow figured out in their official record keeping. They also had it so that there was supposed to be only 4 laundresses maximum per a company. And again, depending on what was going on and how big your posts were, you might have a couple of companies or more companies. And in fact, at Fort Steilacoom, according to the records in 1858, there were 7 laundresses on the post. Now at Fort Wilkins in the 1840s and even into the 1870, when the fort closed for the final time, there were only a couple of laundresses for all the men. Beyond getting paid, and we'll get to the payment part in a minute, the laundresses, because they were an official part of the military there, they received a daily ration of food. It was usually very basic things like beans and flour and maybe a ration of meat. It was the very, very basics. They also might have received fuel, depending on the time period. That could have been coal, it could have been wood for their fires, but of course you had to keep a laundress in fire so that she could heat her water to do the laundry. The other thing that was handy for them was that they could use the services of the post doctors, or if there was a post hospital. So that was beneficial for the laundress and hopefully for her family. So those were just some of the reasons why the laundresses became laundresses. They could be there with their husbands. They could earn these special things, and then there was the pay. Now we talk about minimum wage today. Let's just say they had everything not going for them compared to the way we are these days. In the 1830s and 1840s, the rate of pay for a laundress was generally about 50 cents per month per man. And it would have been about $2 for the single officers and maybe $4 for the married officers, because probably that laundress was then doing some of the laundry for the officers' wives and or children. And the officers got paid a wee bit more. There was oftentimes, if there was an officer who had servants and maybe a bunch of children, the laundress might get paid a wee bit more. Now, compared to some of the non-commissioned officers and some of just the regular Army soldiers, she actually was making pretty good money. You figure at 50 cents for each man each month, she's making, what would that be, about $8.50 a month. And for some of the men, they weren't making much more than that. That was what the pay that I found was supposed to be. However, when I was working at Fort Nisqually, or at Fort Wilkins, not Fort Nisqually, I'll get to that later, there was a note in an official document about the laundresses there that said, for the laundress in 1844, and that was the first year that they built Fort Wilkins up in the UP of Michigan, one laundress was listed with quarters a log quarters. It was a little log cabin, and they said it was in very good order. I wish I could go back and talk to that laundress and find out what her opinion was as to whether it really was in good order or not, but she was probably glad to be there just because she could be with her husband. And at that time in 1844 at Fort Wilkins, she was receiving $1 per man per month for their washing. So that gives you a little bit more about what was going on and how much these laundresses were getting reimbursed for the services that they were doing. I'm going to jump in here a little bit more with Fort Wilkins just because it is very near and dear to my heart, but it also leads into, as we get up into the Fort Steilacoom days, by 1869 at Fort Wilkins, the laundresses still only were earning $1 per man for washing done each month. But that was including their shirts and their handkerchiefs and their underclothes. They also got their daily ration of food at that time. But in addition to that, they could earn an extra 10 cents for doing the men's trousers and 25 cents for doing their overcoats. If you've ever been to Northern Michigan in winter, they definitely needed their overcoats. But I just sit there and I wonder, how did these women feel about doing these grubby old men's clothes, especially since many of these men were out on details, having to cut wood, having to deal with the livestock and such, and not necessarily have to do their trousers. That also has always perplexed me. The other thing the laundresses up there at that time had to do is they had to wash the men's bed sacks once per month, and they had to do that without getting paid at all for it. Now imagine that you're one of these women and you're having to do laundry. And remember, you're not just doing the laundry for the men, you're doing your own laundry. The one thing I've never been very clear on, and hopefully somebody out there has done better research than I have, is how often these laundresses were doing the laundry for the men. Remember, according to the information, it just tells how much she's getting paid per man per month. It's not telling how frequently she was actually doing their laundry. And on top of that, she's having to do her own family's laundry as well, oftentimes in very small quarters. And think of the winters here in the Pacific Northwest, where it's rainy and cold outside. Imagine having to have wet laundry strung up all around inside, say, a one-room cabin, while you're trying to keep your children amused and cook your dinner, do your own family's laundry, do your baking, and you have wet, drippy laundry. I should have hung something up here from the rafters, but imagine putting up with that, and you're having to put up with all these extra grubby men's clothes. So that's the kind of mindset when I think about these laundresses. They were really tough and strong women in many, many ways. Usually the payment was deducted from the soldier's pay. That way she was assured of getting her money and that these guys wouldn't just say they were going to be paying her and then flit off. However, Catherine up at Fort Wilkins in 1869, she and another laundress, and this is why we know her name and know more about her, had to file a petition with the US War Department for debts owed to them by 4 soldiers who had recently been discharged in 1869. Basically, these guys had left, probably had gone off to the copper mines in the Keweenaw Peninsula near where Fort Wilkins was, and they scooted and they never paid the laundresses. As far as I saw a letter later on in 1870, and basically that letter was saying that those laundresses, as of 1870, almost a year later, they still hadn't heard anything from the US War Department. As far as I know, they never got paid for those for doing those 4 men's laundry. But generally, the money was being deducted from the soldier's pay and going directly to the laundress in most cases. Now, that's the military side of things. There were cases of laundresses working and doing the laundry in non-military settings. And I've done some research on that as well. For those of you who are familiar with Fort Steilacoom, you'll also know that it was, before it became Fort Steilacoom, it was basically the farm of Joseph Heath, who was connected to the Hudson's Bay Company a bit and had been brought out to sort of start, oh, I don't know what the right word is, but he had set up his farm basically where Fort Steilacoom is and where Western State is. And he was there starting in about 1844, 1845, about the same time that Fort Wilkins was getting started up in the UP of Michigan. So again, this is still pretty much raw frontier out here. Joseph Heath was from Great Britain. And the wonderful thing about Joseph Heath is many, many, many years after his death, letters and journals of his had been found and were put into a book, I think back in the 1960s. If you have a chance to find a copy of the Heath journal, do it. It's very interesting reading about the agriculture and about the culture at the time of a farmer living down there in that area. But anyway, I went back through the Heath diary because I was really interested. I knew he had hired a lot of, in most cases, Native American workers to help him. And I thought, gee, Heath was the one person who seemed to really enjoy journaling about some of the minutiae in his life. And I thought maybe Joseph actually wrote about laundry and what was going on with his laundry. And I slogged through quite a few pages of the journal, and then I started to pick up some of the information. So in mid-June of 1845, I mentioned this because this goes back to my comments about the grubby soldiers and the men when they were out working and how dirty those clothes would have gotten for those poor laundresses having to do their laundry. I mentioned this fact from the Heath diary that in mid-June of 1845, Heath mentioned that he had just had his first bath of the year in June of 1845. So how'd you like to be his laundress is all I can say. In 1846, Heath did note that there were 3 Indian ladies at work in his cabin at the fire all morning. One was mending his trousers of blue pilot cloth. And then he did mention that the cloth was so worn that there was no way that she could actually mend it. So she was mending it with a patch of deerskin in order to get that there. And that was very common at the time, to put a leather bottom in your breeches to keep them from wearing out. Some of the other entries that I found from Heath, because Joseph was very good and gave me some more information, he noticed that again in March of 1846, that he said that his house was full of clothes drying. Again, imagine being in a small one-room cabin with drippy wet clothes in March in the Pacific Northwest. And he said, to which I had to attend a 3 months wash. So obviously Joseph wasn't doing his laundry all that often. He did go, though, I finally did find some mention more of the women. The next day, he had in his journal that a woman had been ironing clothes all day. And that was about all he said in 1845, 1846 about it. By 1847, he got a little more chatty about the wash. And what was interesting was the person in 1847 that he mentions first doing his wash wasn't a washerwoman, it was a washerman, one of his male Native American servants by the name of Ben. He put that in September of 1847, he mentions that Ben washing shirts and socks for me, doing it better than the washerwoman used to do, to who I paid £4 a year. So he apparently thought that Ben did a better job than the women he had hired previously. Of course, then in October of 1847, Heath apparently tried to do some of his mending to prepare doing his laundry. And he found, and he puts it, I love this quote, he said that he found the mending to be beyond his talents. So he noted that Dolly, one of his Native American women, servants who he had hired did the mending for him instead. And he said of her mending that she made it quite decent. Although he did then, the next sentence, he says that he did do some of his own ironing, and he felt that it turned out better than he expected. One of the last things that we hear from Joseph on the whole matter of laundry and laundresses is in 1848. In mid-February of 1848, he noted that a woman is ironing and mending stockings and skin trousers. And then finally, the last notation that Joseph left that I could find from February 19th of 1848 was, the woman who formerly washed for me and has been washing the present week came to iron the clothes. But before she commenced, she wished to know what I intended giving. And having told her what I intended giving, as much would come to nearly 3 pence per piece, with which she was not satisfied. I turned her off, and myself ironed 5 pairs of trousers and a dozen shirts, not a little to her annoyance and vexation. So sounds like old Joseph had a wee bit of a love-hate relationship with his laundresses or the women who are doing his mending, but he was giving them something in return. Now, before I get on to the basics of doing laundry, especially for any of you who are ever interested in trying to portray a laundry, let's talk about Fort Nisqually. Fort Nisqually was a Hudson's Bay company. It was the first non-native establishment here on Puget Sound. And we know that they also utilized, in particular, some of the Native American women as laundresses at the fort. I was able to do some articles a number of years ago for Fort Nisqually Foundation's publication occurrences about laundry and about the wash house. We know there was a building at Fort Nisqually that is shown on drawings and talked about as a wash house. We assume that it was for doing laundry, but it was really tough getting particulars about it. However, Dr. Tolmie, who was the chief factor in charge at Fort Nisqually, did give some good information about what he was paying women to do the laundry out of his personal account and for the women and for his family. So at Fort Nisqually in 1854, apparently there was a woman named Sarah, Native American woman, may have been married to probably married to one of the other workers at the fort. And we know that she was paid 5 yards of plaid linseys, 3 yards, 26 inches of gray cotton, and 1 shawl for washing tablecloths for 1.5 months. I don't know whether they were actually just all tablecloths or if she might have been doing some other things. In the 1850s, by the end of 1859, when the Tolmies left to move to Victoria, BC, they had, I believe, 6 little boys. And so imagine the number of diapers that Jane Tolmie was going to need help with. In 1855, a Mrs. Jack was paid 12 yards of navy blue cotton for washing tablecloths. And then another woman, Mrs. Ewey, received 1 printed cashmere shawl for washing the cloths. And then in 1856, it's noted that 2 pairs of cotton braces and 1 common striped shirt was paid to Mrs. James for 2 pairs socks. Now, I'm not sure on that notation. I've looked it up. I'm not sure if that meant that she had made a couple of pairs of socks for the Tolmies or if she was washing socks for the Tolmies. I'm not really sure. And they didn't give me enough information to know that about. But at Fort Nisqually, instead of being paid in coin, Dr. Tolmie was obviously paying the laundresses that he was employing through his account at the company store there at the sales shop. And I've often, when I've done tours or helped with field trips at Fort Nisqually, been asked, well, that's not fair. And I said, but imagine if you were a woman and you needed clothing for your family and you're going to be making your own clothing, being able to go in to the company sales shop and say, I want, 3 yards of this cloth specifically, it's as good as making payment in coin to her. She can go in and pick out exactly what she wants on that day that she's getting paid. So that's a little bit about the laundresses themselves. One thing I should note, these women were tough. They would put just about any of us to shame with our modern washers and dryers, I think, because they just had to be tough. Doing laundry back in that day required a lot of activity and a lot of strength. So let's take a look at what was needed. First of all, you'd have to have some way, and hopefully you guys can see some of this as I hold it up. You'd need buckets to collect your water. And depending on how far you were from a well or a stream or a lake, you might have used something like the water yoke here, which would allow you to pick up 2 buckets at a time, put it around your neck, and hopefully carry those back. When I tell the kids, when I do field trips and I talk about the laundresses, imagine having to be the one, and you would, if you had kids, you would have been sending those kids back and forth to the local creek or the well to gather the water. You're talking probably at least 30 to 50 buckets of water, depending on how many wash tubs you might have. So you would get buffed just because you were having to carry all that water all the time. So you're going to need your wooden buckets. And the reason I say wooden is until you really get into the later part of the 19th century, there could have been, you might have had tin buckets, but tin buckets were going to cost you generally more than the wooden buckets. But galvanization, when we see all the metal galvanized buckets that we see today, you really don't start to see those till late into the 19th century. So galvanization was around, starting basically the technology and the theory in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, but the whole process really wasn't all that common yet until you get later into the 19th century, into the 1870s, 1880s, and especially by the time you get into the 1890s. You're really not seeing many galvanized buckets or wash tubs at that point. So your wash tubs are mostly going to be wood. I didn't put a wash tub in here only because you probably wouldn't be able to see me if I had a wash tub in front of me as well as these buckets. But you'd need a wash tub. You need some kind of soap. Now, a lot of times, both at Fort Nisqually and at the military posts, you could go to the quartermaster store, you could go to the sales shop, you could buy soap. But if you were a really penny pinching laundress, you might have wanted to make your own soap. Basics, if you haven't made soap, is especially for lye soap, is you're going to need animal fats to boil down, and then you're going to need a whole bunch of wood ashes where you pour water through and have it come out some kind of trough kind of system without the ashes coming through, screened or something else. And that's going to slowly drip lye through. And what drips out after you run the water through the ashes is going to be lye. And it depends on how strong it's going to be from the ashes and how watered down. You put those together and you heat those very carefully together, and you're going to get a basic soap. May not be a very hard soap, but you can use the soft soap, actually in some ways easier than you can that. So you either have to buy your soap or you got to make your soap. You would have some kind of washboard. Again, what we commonly see, and I'm going to put this one up close, this is a carved wooden washboard. What we commonly see nowadays are the galvanized washboards that have the metal ribbing on it. But again, galvanization is just barely getting started. So most of the time you're going to be looking at wooden washboards, wooden wash sticks to be doing the scrubbing on. You might have had some kind of stick or a paddle to help lift, especially out of the hot water wash buckets and such, you might have had a stick or a paddle to lift that out so that you're not scalding your hands if the water is really hot. The other thing you might have had, and I've got to see what I did with it, would be your bluing. Now there's different ways of doing bluing or whitening things. Bluing was basically just a dye. Let's see if I can get this up here. This is one kind. Back then you might have had little balls of bluing. Yeah, nowadays you mostly find bluing in a liquid form. What the bluing did was this would be your last rinse, and you'd put your bluing, and I don't have this one unwrapped, but I'd unwrap it from this. I drop it into a little bag, a bluing bag like this, and put it in my one of my last rinse buckets. Now all bluing does is it's an optical illusion. So when you get white clothes that have started to yellow or gray, you'd soak them in the bluing water that you had in one of your wash tubs. The optical illusion of the blue mixing with the yellowish color makes it all look whiter. But it really is just an optical illusion that luckily the human eye lets us do that. But that's another thing you need. You need a bag and some bluing. So those are some of the basic things. The other thing you would want to have close by would be sewing supplies, because before or after, depending on how dirty the clothes are, you need to mend all those clothes so that they're in good shape when you return them to the soldier or to your employer, or even for your own family. And then some of the last things you might need to finish it, and we're going to get to this in a minute, is your sad irons. A lot of different reasons for calling it a sad iron. Probably one of the most popular ones, and I can't say it's 100%. These things weigh quite a bit. And so these women were buff. You didn't need CrossFit in the 19th century if you were ironing laundry. And you'd have to have more than one iron, because you'd have to have one heating on your stove the whole time that you were ironing your others, so that you could trade them out, because the heat doesn't last very long. By the end of the 19th century or so, we get to where instead of just having the cast iron irons, we're getting some of the irons that have removable wooden handles. Now that's really handy, because now instead of having to have multiple big heavy irons, you have to take a cloth like this and wrap around the iron to keep from burning your hand. You can just switch your wooden handle back and forth and off your different irons. So you needed your irons. And then some of the last things you would need to do your laundry is you would need cloths. Could be just a plain white cloth, piece of cotton, or something that you could lay on top of the clothing that you're getting ready to iron, because you didn't want to get the soot from your iron onto the clothes you were ironing. So you would take a cloth, lay it on what you're ironing, and then you would iron on top of the cloth. Now, sometimes to help, especially if your stove was really rusty and there was a lot of soot on it, you might have a small bag, kind of like your bluing bag, that you would fill with a little bit of salt and seal it closed. That way, if you needed to clean the bottom of your iron when it came off the stove, you could take your salt bag and just rub your iron across that a couple of times and then do your ironing. And hopefully the coarseness of that cloth with the salt in there would clean the bottom enough so that you could iron cleanly and not dirty up the clothes that you had just laundered. So now you've got all your supplies, a little bit more than what we need for doing our modern wash with a washer and dryer and such. Oh, and did I mention that as far as wash tubs, you wouldn't have just had one wash tub. You would have had minimum of 2 wash tubs, and oftentimes, especially these laundresses who were doing multiple people's laundries, they'd have anywhere from 4 to 6 wash tubs. And again, you're going to have to get about, for 2 wash tubs, you're going to be getting about 30 or so buckets of water. So figure you're going to be getting about 60 buckets or so of water if you're going to have 4 wash tubs. And the reason you had to have so many is you needed your first wash tub with your hot water, and you would start your wash in that. You'd move that to your next wash tub that might be a rinse wash tub to get the soap out. Then you might move it to the next wash tub that had your bluing or something else in. And all of these would be going slowly down in temperature until you get to your final rinse tub, where you could rinse everything out and hang it up on the line. Or in some cases, you might not have had a clothesline, so you might have used some of the bushes outside. There's accounts of women at some of their cabins as they're coming in here to these frontier areas where they would just spread the laundry out on clean bushes outside or on clean grassy areas. Now imagine trying to keep your livestock and your children from running their little muddy paws and muddy hooves and little muddy feet off of your clean laundry after you've done it. So it probably would have been really nice to have had a rope so that you could hang your laundry up. But now that you've got your supplies, how are you going to do your laundry? Laundry was a much longer, drawn out process than it is today. And not only that, you had to be doing all your cooking, all your other chores, possibly helping if you were on a farm or something with those kind of activities, maybe out milking cows or doing other things. But in general, the order was, and little girls especially were taught this at a young age. You've probably heard the popular poem of wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, bake on Wednesday. This one I find interesting. This is from a British source. Brew on Thursday, churn on Friday, mend on Saturday, and go to meeting on Sunday. Another version that I had heard and I'm more familiar with is wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on Wednesday, churn on Thursday. They got rid of the brewing, obviously, over here in the States. Clean on Friday, bake on Saturday, and rest on Sunday. But the two that stand out to me when you hear the poem, no matter which version you're looking at, it's always wash on Monday and iron on Tuesday. Part of the reason that you would have been doing your washing on Monday is you really would have started the process with your non-woolen type clothes on Saturday. At that time, you'd take a wash tub, especially if you had grubby men's shirts and such, and you would have filled a wash tub up with just plain water, and you would have soaked those grubby, greasy clothes from Saturday until Monday morning. That way it would loosen up some of that dirt inside the fibers of the clothes for that 2 days. And then first thing on Monday morning, you'd be getting up extra early, getting your fires starting. And you would have had to have, I probably didn't mention this before, you'd need some kind of boiler. Oftentimes they were copper boilers so that you could boil larger batches of water up. And you would go and start your fire to get it going. You would haul the water, or hopefully you had some children that you could send down to haul the water for you. Remember, we're talking anywhere from 30 to 60 buckets of water, and you'd be heating part of that water up. That hot water, once you got it heated, would be going into your first wash tub. The other thing you would have learned as a young girl to become a laundress was the order that you would choose to do your washing. Nowadays, we just spin a knob on our washer to tell whether we want it to, if it's doing whites or colors, or if it's a large load or a small load. But basically, in general, you would start with your lightly soiled clothes first. That way you can maintain using the same water for a longer period of time before you have to send little Johnny down to the creek to get another, 10 buckets or so of water for you. So you'd start with your lightly soiled things and then work up to your heavier soiled things. And that's how you would do your laundry. And you would go through the different wash tubs, through the different pieces of doing the laundry. The one that you would be very careful with, and normally you wouldn't wash them very much, would be woolen clothes. With your woolens or your very, what we would call the very, silks and things like that, you might brush those. And there were actually special brushes you could use to brush some of the woolen clothes and things like that, because you didn't want to be shrinking those or ripping them. If there was a particularly dirty spot on your clothes, that's when you would bring the washboard into play. And you might put some extra soap on the clothes and then rub it. I often joke that those poor women, or at least those little girls, when they first were learning to do laundry, they must have had the most chewed up knuckles and things from the ridges, but I bet they calloused up pretty quick. So that's your basic ways of doing the laundry itself. Now, the last part, and we're getting close here, and I had told Walter that by about 10 till I would stop chatting.
I'm riveted. I didn't want to say anything, but yeah, we do want to allow for a few questions.
Yeah,
this is amazing.
If there's questions. So after you've done the laundry, the next part of the poem is Iron on Tuesday. Basically, like I've mentioned several times, after you've done all that washing, after you've hung it up, and again, I cannot get the image of being in a one-room cabin with dripping men's trousers all over the place around me as I'm trying to dry. The next day, once those had dried, hopefully, that's when you would grab your sad iron and have either a table with a wool blanket or something underneath so that it becomes basically your ironing board, and you would iron. Again, you didn't need CrossFit if you were doing laundry in the 19th century, because these irons could weigh anywhere from a pound or two up to 8 to 12 pounds. At Fort Nisqually, we've got one that I believe is a 8 or 10 pound tailor's iron there. And so these women, you didn't want to mess with these ladies. These ladies could take you down at their whim. So Tuesday would be your ironing day. Let's see, what else? Oh, the last few things that I want to mention, and then Walter will turn it over if anybody has any questions, is the sayings. We all have heard some of the sayings that they had. One was, don't go airing your dirty laundry. And basically that means you want to not let things from your family or your friends go out in public. Well, and where's that come from? It does come from everybody doing laundry back then. Because if you were airing your dirty laundry, then everybody was seeing your unmentionables and they were seeing your dirty laundry. How bad would that be for a woman? Remember, again, this is a culture where this is one of the main tasks of women. The last thing you'd want to be doing is hanging up dirty laundry and things like that. So those are, that's one of the sayings that you can get. And I was trying to find my notes here, but I have now managed to lose my place because I never stick to my notes when I do these kind of things. There are a number of other things that come up with laundry, and they still trickle down to us in this day and age. But the reality is being a laundress, although it was hard, hot, miserable work in so many ways, it did give those women a way to make some extra money or get some of the items that they needed for themselves or their families that a lot of women didn't have the opportunity to get at that time for themselves. So being a laundress gave these women something that let them define themselves in a time period when often the only thing that defined a woman was who she married and who her children were, particularly her sons. So with that, I think we've got about 8-9 minutes left, and I don't know.
Round of applause, round of virtual applause for Peggy. A question, thank you. And thank you for including Joseph Heath and his diary and what was going on in our local environment. It's fascinating to read that diary and try to figure out what his relationship was with the natives. We had a question come in on chat. How much was laundry a communal activity for women, socializing and camaraderie and all that? Was it?
That's a really good question. I can't say 100%, because every situation was different, but there's definitely been, you'll read accounts and stuff of women getting together to do the laundry. On the military posts, like I said, there were often more than one laundress on the post. I would imagine, and I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I would imagine that some of those laundresses would get together to share supplies. You know, if they needed 4 or 6 wash tubs, they might have been able to get together to do some of that. So there was communal, and again, it was also a training ground because you were training your daughters how to do this, because whether they became a laundress themselves or not, they were gonna have to be doing laundry. So hopefully that answers that a little bit.
So let's experiment. Well, before we move on to the next question, 2 things real quick. I do want to acknowledge Jessica Kidder, who put together this program working with you, and also the program on the next 2 Saturdays. Jessica couldn't be here, but we appreciate that. And then in chat, I put a link to the next 2 programs on Saturdays that we're celebrating for Women's History Month. We are a small enough group, not counting the people who are going to watch this, that I think if someone wants to take themselves off mute, I believe I made that possible. I cut Peggy off earlier, and I'm glad we figured that out, because this would have been a great thing done with interpretive dance, but it was great to hear your words. Yes, thank you. Would anyone like to take yourself off mute and ask a question? Joe, go ahead.
Yes, Peggy, I enjoyed your presentation. My question is, I've been told that if your Army spouse passed away or deserted or whatever, you had 30 days to vacate your house at the fort. And so what that led to was a lot of like instant romances and second marriages, so that you could maintain your family in the same location.
I have heard that. I've seen some accounts of that too. And let's face it, there was a whole lot of reason, whether you were a military spouse or another or a woman someplace else, to try and get linked up again pretty quickly. I don't have any specific accounts that I can do, but I've heard that same thing, that there were a lot, especially in the military, because those women were being, told, it's time for you to get out, that they would often link up. Now, the good news on a military post is there was a whole abundance of men. I don't know how great abundance of those men were, but there was an abundance of men if she needed that. But yeah, I have heard that. I've read some things where Mrs. So-and-so, lost her, especially during some of the frontier, for lack of a better term, conflicts with Native Americans and such, would lose a husband and then would end up marrying another soldier, usually within his own company and such.
Right.
Hey, before I saw a couple people go off mute, and I think we'll have time. A question that came in on chat was, how about wringing laundry? Our setup at Fort Steilacoom utilizes a horizontal wooden rod between the wash tubs. Was this typical? Any other ways early laundry was wrung?
Very good question. To be honest, I haven't really researched that too much. For the most part, like I said, these were buff women. Perhaps they might have used a setup like that because, what we see in antique stores and such today with the washer wringers that would go with the tubs. In fact, I've got one sitting out in my yard right now. Those, again, aren't coming into play till later in the 19th century. I don't have a great answer for you, other than these were buff women and they could do a lot of wringing by hand too. So
I saw a couple of people go off mute, so anyone wants to ask a question.
Yeah, let me show you a couple of things too. This is Virginia Mesher, about 15, 20 years ago, had written a couple of good little pamphlet type books. I don't know if they're still available through her shop. She's got some great things. There's a great laundry handbook that actually does more in depth than I do with the specifics of it. If you have a chance, I have nothing other than I think they do a great job. If you go to the James Townsend YouTube channel, they've got a great series with the drunken, I think it's the Drunken Laundress. If you want to learn more, if you're going to be doing an impression, check that out. Even though her persona is from the 18th century, it gives a lot of great laundry information for anybody who's going to be doing a laundress persona.
What's the name of that channel again?
It's the James Townsend, which sells a lot of mostly 18th century reenacting supplies, but they have a YouTube channel. And I believe it's something like the Drunken Laundress, and it's like a 3 or 4 part series on their channel. Great. She does an awesome job with it. Okay. Any other questions out there?
Peggy, again, this is Joe. You said earlier that the pay was like 50 cents a month per soldier. So did each laundress have a certain number of soldiers assigned to her? Is that how that worked?
Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, in the beginning, you know, from some of the records and some of the research from Fort Steilacoom that Jessica was able to get me and stuff, early on, it was 1 laundress per 17 men, supposedly.
Okay.
And again, later on, they upped that to 19 and a half men. I still can't figure out half men and stuff. Now, of course, that also depends on the military post you're at, how many men they actually have there. So they might have had, you know, say you're at a small post that only has 20 men, they may have only just had 1 laundress for that post instead of having 2. Or depending on how the officer in charge might have been willing to have another, you know, one of his non-commissioned officers' wives be a second laundress, that could happen too. So it really depended on the post. From what I learned, and again, this was almost 40 years ago up at Fort Wilkins, it really also was a bit at the whim and pleasure of your post commander and such on who got to become the laundress and such things like that.
Okay. Any other questions?
One more. I understand that the paymaster only came to Fort Steilacoom like every 4 months from the Presidio in San Francisco. So I would hope that, you know, someone is maintaining meticulous records, you know, so the poor laundress doesn't get cheated.
Well, and that's where, you know, I also was mentioning that in general, the regulation was supposed to be that that laundress was getting, that it was being taken out of the men's pay and it wasn't left to the guys themselves to be paying her. But like I said, there is the one situation up at Fort Wilkins in 1869 where the laundresses actually sent a letter to the US War Department complaining that 4 of the men who had left the service had left without paying them. And it could be a situation like that the paymaster hadn't come in or something. And so they were able to scoot with their money without that ever getting forwarded to the laundress. So yeah, I mean, and again, we're talking women in the mid 19th century and women doing, to be honest, a very dirty deed as it is. So it wasn't considered, you know, a high class kind of thing. They probably didn't necessarily have a lot of pushback status, except that how would you like to get a laundress really angry at you find out that your underwear that she's washed has been starched to high heaven? Have a heck of a time. So don't kick off the laundresses is all I can say.
You know, I feel like I know like 50 times more than I did before about this aspect of life. So when I do tours at the fort, I can talk so intelligent. Peggy, thank you. This has been wonderful. I love that this recording will live in our archives so that people can be so informed about something that everybody took for granted, as you said, and yet was part of daily life so extensively. So, okay, another virtual round of applause for Peggy. Thank you all for putting up with my Zoom skills. And thank you. I hope I see you all again soon.
Yep, and thank you all for joining in. I recognize quite a few of the faces there. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.